thank you for joining me today.
Hey, pleasure.
I'm excited to have you here. Obviously, we have a relationship that extends beyond this brief conversation we're going to have, and
Indeed.
I'm excited to kind of kick it off with you. You are a senior executive with the Marion and Henry W. Bloch Foundation and the H&R Bloch Foundation, and obviously a critical partner for the Bloch School. So it seemed like this would be a great place to kind of start the conversation. So thank you for being here.
Oh, well, hey, listen, thanks for the opportunity, man. It's going to be fun. I can imagine what we're going to discuss.
Where we will go. And, you know, part of what's interesting to me is you've started out kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the Hispanic Business Development Organization.
Well, actually, yeah. So when I actually go back further than that. When I was undergrad at UMKC, I was working full time between two organizations, the Guadalupe Centers at the time, and the Hispanic Economic Development Corporation. And then when I finished that, finished up my undergrad, I left and went to go work for the National Council of La Raza, doing work for a group that's based out of DC, and then I was up in Chicago. And then I found my way back, and somehow magically they put me in charge of the Hispanic Economic Development Corporation, and I've been causing problems ever since.
And you've had the kind of, and I guess we're going to kind of talk about the hairy times that we find ourselves in a little bit, and
Sure.
any insights you have from that, both as a, from a foundation perspective, but I think more importantly from your perspective. I mean, you did community foundation work with one of the biggest, most influential community foundations in the country. You worked with Guadalupe Centers, so being a nonprofit executive, but you also have, your family has a business too, and so.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, like, I mean, when this has all started happening, and where does your first thought go to what we need to be thinking about in Kansas City right now?
No, it's a good question. Well, I can tell you my first thought that went to is, oh man, I have to help out my parents because they do have a business and it's in the food industry. And I thought to myself, we and my brothers have to circle the wagons around my parents, because we're fortunate, that we have jobs that we can work from home that are going to provide us steady income, both to us as well as our spouses. So we were fortunate in that regard. So where my mind went was immediately to them, which is, I'm sure, 99.9% of everybody in this country went to their families. After that, from a job perspective, I thought to myself, all right, what are things that we as a foundation need to be thinking about to support what is currently happening and what is going to come? How can we not be duplicative in our efforts, but then also leverage additional resources as much as possible and stay at a systems level approach, because that's just been something we've been effective at doing for years and years to come. And if we did that, then over time, others would join, others would take on the different aspects that are needed in the community, everything from basic services, the emergency assistance sort of work, making sure people are getting, have access to food. And so we really, my mind kind of went to the broader sort of systems level approach to address the issues here in Kansas City as much as possible.
Well, I think of all of our conversations in the past, I think of you as a disruptor. Not necessarily, I don't want to put that label in the foundations that you are a leader of, but you definitely, I think have a disruptive innovation perspective on things. And what are the areas where you see the need for disruption to benefit Kansas City right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the areas, and it ties back to my initial comments, is there needs to be a lot more disruption occurring within the lending industry, right? Both from the standpoint of getting access to capital into communities of color, as well as to underserved communities or neighborhoods. How can philanthropy continue to, along with government, really partner together to challenge the banking and the lending industry to put that money towards those communities? Because we've seen historically, when dollars make it there, those places perform in terms of creating jobs, not just for themselves, but for people just like them or people within their neighborhoods, which is a huge benefit. So I think that there is a good argument from an economic standpoint as to why that sort of needs to be in place. The second area, I think, within disruption is, once again, we've seen the inequity that's occurred as a result of the pandemic from a health outcome standpoint. We're doing a lot wrong when it comes to that. I am not a health funder per se. I am not in the health industry, but what I do recognize that there is a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that people of color, low-income individuals as well, or the combination of those two, need to have better access to healthcare or health prevention sort of services. When you see stats that are in the state of Georgia talking about 80% of the population of those that are hospitalized are African American, we're doing a heck of a lot wrong in this country. My guess is, even though I don't know that those stats or that data here in Kansas City, my guess is we're on par with some of those sort of numbers. So I think those are two sort of areas that could really use some disruption and innovation. And the last, and it's funny that we're talking about it because you and I have had various conversations, everything from how we educate adult populations for workforce, and then as well, how do we create efficient systems within the nonprofit sector to deliver better quality, better outcomes for people in need. So that is a wide variety of things that I think disruption, just off the top of my head, would be essential to a better, healthier Kansas City.
So I think that we could probably talk for hours about the limitations of funding models and where the biases exist in those. I also think, though, would be interesting from your perspective, person of color too. What do companies that are led by people of color, what could they be doing better to position themselves and advocate for themselves for capital, in a time like this, but even in other times of, less chaos?
Sure, that's a great question. I would tell you that, to me, engaging in places where you're not comfortable engaging at times. Going to participate in chamber events, the Greater Kansas City Chamber events, or your local chamber, wherever community your business is in, organizing your other, minority-owned businesses, owners, those guys together collectively, but not simply go for the support of government and to sort of bail you out or in some way serve as the advocate for you, but rather demonstrate to them the value and what you bring to the sort of table. I think that's a different sort of role. So many times historically, it's always been this idea, or there's this sort of ongoing perception that I think occurs within those communities to say, oh, give me a handout. I don't think that's the case. I can tell you, I come from a family of people who started businesses left and right, and none of them ever asked for a government handout. All they wanted was a fair share of support out of City Hall or the county or the state. Is all they sort of asked for. So I think those are things that those communities need to continue to do. I know it's funny, I'm sure when somebody watches this video, they're going to be like, wait, hold on, a guy with a French name is a person of color? Well, I think that's going to sound funny, but I swear to you, my parents are from Mexico, so it's
what it is. Somewhere back in the lineage, there was
a French guy who showed up in Mexico. Yeah, it was a great grandfather of mine. That's basically what it was. So but on the other side of my family, all my family, my family's been here back and forth from Mexico for generations, and so but one other thing I would say about that topic is that when you have a banking relationship, challenge that lender to do more for you. And if they're not doing more for you, then shop around. I think people, just like you do on your personal finance side, once you get comfortable, you don't want to move your accounts. Oh, it's a pain to do that sort of stuff. But really, you got to challenge those institutions to do things because the flow of capital exists out there. It's just a matter of going out and competing for it, just like the general mainstream does so often. But I guess there's just a level of comfort, or there's a brand loyalty that exists. I don't know what it is, but sometimes people of color get hung up on that and don't want to challenge that. And they also have this fear, I think, of times of debt, right? And I've seen that historically. That's why they go to their friends and their family and their close-knit circles to borrow the money that they need. Well, the problem is, and this, it's not as if that access to capital is as great within those personal circles as they are for most white populations in this country. I mean, they have a greater access to capital from that circle. So you got to get used to working with banks. And when you're working with the bank, don't feel like just because that one gave you love, that's the only one you got to stick with. There's plenty of other resources out there. Become educated on that. So
that's a great point, right? Because I think a lot of smaller entities, whether they're run by people of color or minority populations or not, don't realize purchasing power and the value of purchasing power if they come together, and the pressure they can put on the suppliers of capital or anything else to make influences.
Yeah, well, and it also is just the power of the coalition to then advocate for everything from the city to make sure that those curbs and sidewalks are repaired, all the way through make sure we get the trees trimmed. Hey, guess what? To have the police patrol more in our areas, or to advocate against an increase in the sales tax that might be detrimental upon your business. All those things, right? But when you go out about it independently, it's very, very difficult to sort of participate in.
So this is a minor shift, but I think it's relevant to what you're talking about also, in that Henry Bloch was a phenomenal entrepreneur.
Yes.
And we honor that legacy of his entrepreneurial spirit, but we don't always necessarily focus on something else he did really, really well, which was build a phenomenal enterprise that is at the other end of the entrepreneurial spectrum sometimes, right? That is a institution, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about your perspective, because we always like to say, be entrepreneur, go be an entrepreneur, start up a business, be entrepreneur, start. From your perspective, what's the mix that we need between the established institutions that H&R Block became and the startups that H&R Block was? And so whether it's in the nonprofit sector or the lending sector or anywhere else, where, like, what role do we need more of right now? Should we be supporting the bigger institutions or encouraging more entrepreneurship, or what's the right mix?
Well, I think that, it's a tough question, right?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an actual number.
I don't know if there's exactly. Yeah, I don't know if there's a right answer to that one. But I would say, if you look at where job creation happens, right? People always point towards the large industries or the large corporations, when in actuality that's not really the case, right?
Okay.
Where you look at where the economy really benefits most from is really small businesses, from everything from the mom and pop shop up to maybe something like a Boulevard Brewery, right? The roasteries of the world. That's where the jobs are created, the income's created, GDP is sort of happening. So I'm biased, right? I am biased towards little guy. I'm biased towards those kinds of industries. I do think you need, or excuse me, that type of sector. I do think you need large institutional businesses, because they support smaller businesses as they become vendors of those large industries. But to simply bail out and continue to sort of provide the funding, especially the public institutions, publicly traded institutions, seems a bit counter to what we are as a nation, right? So to me, I think the more we can emphasize entrepreneurship, but not just entrepreneurship just for entrepreneurship's sake, right? But towards the discipline around having an idea, sticking with that idea, failing, getting back up, continuing to evolve that to the point in which you do have you do create a business, you do create jobs, not just for yourself, but for others. That is a tremendous benefit to us as a country. Henry, people forget, Henry failed for years before they became even got into the tax industry. I mean, they were everything from a bookkeeper to marketing and everything in between. And it wasn't until some sage advice came from a guy over at the Kansas City Star, said, what you should do is really focus on income tax return and help out there. And that's kind of where they found their sweet spot. But this is after 5-6 years of ongoing failure. Henry was ready to give up, and I think that more than anything else is what we need to continue to sort of encourage. And some people, hey, they call it quits, good for them, but I think this country will benefit, and this community will benefit for a lot more people like Henry with that kind of spirit of stick-to-itiveness that ultimately gets you to. Well, it'd be great if everybody could create a large corporation like Henry, but I don't think that was Henry's goal ever.
Sure.
Was his goal. His goal was to treat people well,
mm-hmm.
to give them an affordable price. And that was something that could help out and give back to the community. That was it. You did those things, and look what you ended up creating. So, yeah. But I do think I tend to lean more towards a small micro enterprise, the smaller businesses, than I ever would more towards the large industry. Even
How
though,
do we better reward failure, right? Because I think that's always the issue, right? Like, because I agree with you, right? You look at the success of entrepreneurs, rarely are they successful in the first one. I mean, there are a couple of those out there, but most of them have some missteps along the way. How do you reward good failure? What is good failure? What is bad failure when you're looking at a grantee, or I think you're on the board of AltCap, or we're on the board.
Yeah. No, I just got off. I'm on the,
Okay.
I just got off the board of there. Yeah, but I have involvement with them since the beginning. So when I'm looking at a loan or when I'm looking at a grant, I could tell you, no matter what your plan is, it's always going to go a different way, right?
Yep.
But if you're willing to put skin in the game, that's a good indicator, right? If you've done your homework and sort of analyzed your market, that's a good sort of indicator, whether that's in the nonprofit or the for-profit side. Whether you've done, you've demonstrated an ability to manage money, right? Whether that's on a personal level or on a, or you're managing on behalf of your employer or yourself. Those things I think come out more than anything else. And so when you fail, it's not because you didn't have those base skills in place. Gotcha. You failed because other things sort of happened. And that's okay. We're willing to, especially like when I think about the loans we do, or I have done out of AltCap, part of it's just character, right? And people's character. And if you demonstrate, and I go back to my early days in HEDC and my work with other groups, like a group out of Chicago called Action back in the day, the character loans that they were doing for people, these people have no credit. They have no collateral, right? But even if they failed, they still pay back. Their business was defunct at that point, but they were still paying back their $10,000 loan. That, I think, speaks better to, anything else, right? And so the same goes in the nonprofit, right? Yeah. If you're dealing with a nonprofit, you give them money, you say, hey, let's pilot this project and see how it goes. That project, for whatever circumstances, doesn't go the way they thought. There's a lot of learning in it. They're being transparent about how they used it. They're showing progress in terms of gathering knowledge. And ultimately, if they're just saying, look, it didn't work, we want to pivot. Okay, that's okay too. But when you fail, or you're so afraid of failing that what you do is create, in essence, status quo, well then, I don't know if that's good to support, whether it's a business or a grant to a nonprofit. What I mean? I don't know. Hope that helps.
Well, yeah, it does. It's great. And so I'll start wrapping up because your time's valuable. But I am curious, what's a good idea look like? You're an evaluator of ideas. What are the elements of a good idea? Not a specific idea, but what's an element?
That's a really good question. I think it's looking at an issue or a challenge or a problem, whatever that is, and being able to clearly define what the problem is, what the challenge is. So I think that's the first thing. If you can articulate that, right? And even if you don't have the solution quite worked out, that you got a couple ideas, and those ideas are either based upon some sound reasoning, logic, that are based upon some forms of data, that's based upon others having done things, right, that you can sort of support that, or is completely just out there. But man, it goes back it goes back to this idea that there is some logic around it. So even if it's unproven, there's some logic around that sort of stuff. So I think when you go there, and then I'd say the last piece around a good idea is that you have a way to measure it, right? You know how to measure the throughput, output, outcome, all the way through and through. So that, I think, is applicable whether it's for-profit or nonprofit or governmental, right? If you can do those things, then to me, man, that's just a good idea. If you can articulate all that, most people who have good ideas can probably do that within, I don't know, 2-3 minutes within their discussion with you. Yeah. And you can see right away whether or not that they've thought about this in a meaningful sort of way that has those components to it.
So is the reverse true then? Do you find that when someone doesn't really have a good idea, they like?
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, I grew up in the West Side, so I'm really quick to sort of judge people on their BS factor. I get, I just can, So, I was around a lot of dudes like that growing up. So, so I think part of it is, yeah, the reverse is true, that people are just saying it because they're trying to appeal. They want you to buy into it based upon your heart solely. Like, oh, let me give you a sob story, or let me play the poor me's, or let me tell you about all the disadvantages, as opposed to sort of saying, taking all that into context, in spite thereof, or because of those things, this is why I want to move forward. So yeah, I think the part of it is in the reverse. It will lack data. It will lack measurement. It'll lack logic. It'll lack, some sort of proven method that they've sort of glommed upon. So yeah, no, without those things, I think what you end up getting is same old, and those ideas probably deserve to die.
How important, and I'll end with this, how important is the perspective of the person someone's trying to serve, whether it be for-profit or nonprofit, to you as you evaluate their idea when they're asking you for support?
That's a good question. So help me to understand that the person's perspective.
So if I'm going to serve, let's say I'm developing some sort of product or service for high school kids. How important is it for me in the communication of my idea to demonstrate their perspective to you as a funder or a lender or someone who give me capital?
Yeah, I think part of it is, I want to understand motivation, right? Rather, I get your point too around perspective, but part of it is just, what is the motivation sort of here, right? And so I'm trying to, funders don't, and lenders don't, or investors don't buy into necessarily the idea. They're buying into the person, right? I mean, I tend to think that when we fund something, or when I've approved the loans, or when I've invested in something, I'm doing that because I believe in the person, right? And so perspective, motive, character are the things that I guess mean a heck of a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then you look to things like that person's track record. You look towards that individual's character as perceived by others that you trust and you value. And I think that more than anything else, I could tell you that is a huge lesson that I learned from Henry. I mean, Henry preached that, your character is everything, right? You treat people right. You treat the client right. You treat your partners right. That's what you have. Character is everything. So as we look at these sort of ideas, now granted, there's stuff that just comes in that's easy because, hey, it's, you could just do A plus B equals C, so here you go. But when we're talking about real investment, when we're talking about real loan dollars or real grant dollars or personal investment dollars, right? To me, I have to know that I have to have a lot of faith and trust in that person. I have to know their character. And I hope to God that person's character is 1,000 times better than mine, because mine's always been suspect, So, so I'm a good judge of bad character. I can tell you right now. I can. Oh no, man, I wouldn't go with that dude. He's just like me. But in general, I think
it's a great ending point, because I think it's one of the areas that we're constantly trying to get better at Bloch, which is we can teach technicians. But part of what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we also have to teach people in how to build successful networks and build successful reputations and brands for themselves. Because when it's uncertain, that's where people are going to fall to on a judgment.
They are, And I would say, the building of the networks, and like I said, the building of that character, and building of a brand, personal brand that is strong, that is authentic, right? Yeah. It has to be authentic, because people will tend to sort of see through that. I mean, I like to think myself, and over the years have built a good, strong reputation of being a straight shooter.
Yeah.
Somebody that
there's no doubt that's true.
Yeah. but tries to do good and is transparent about the work that I'm about and what I believe in, and try to surround myself with good people. If I can do that and others can do that, there's no doubt in my mind this place, Kansas City, would be a much, much better place when it's all said and done. And I think the work that the Bloch School's doing, if you guys can teach that, if you can instill that, right, as a value within the students and who attend, or either the school as an undergrad or come as education or executive education or at the graduate level, whatever that might be. And there's no better thing you can have as an individual. So my best of luck to you guys in doing all that work. You're doing great things at the Bloch School. I'm fortunate to be a graduate of it, and now I get to work with it on a whole other level on a regular basis. And, Henry would talk about just how much he loved Kansas City and how he always wants to get back to the place that he gave to. I feel the same way. I truly feel the same way. I get to wake up every morning and do good things for Kansas City. What more could a guy ask for, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate your time. You're a good man.
Thank you, sir. Likewise. Hey, man, listen, and I'll see you at the barbershop, all right?
Yeah, this is the official Bloch haircut, apparently.
That's a good look. All right, Russ. Take care. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, Jean Paul.
All right, no problem. Bye-bye.